That joke isn't funny anymore. Available on Amazon and everywhere. Hey guys, welcome back to the Lou Perez podcast. I'm your host, Lou Perez, and today I'm really happy to be joined by Hunter Ash. He's a writer. He teaches statistics, and if you don't follow him yet on Twitter, X, you can. His handle is Artemis Consort, ArtemisConsort. I hope I spelt it correctly. Hunter, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So the handle, where'd the handle come from? Artemis Consort.
Oh, it's just it's kind of an inside joke with a friend of mine.
I hope your friend still follows you, because if they didn't, that would be that would be terrible.
There'd be no one else to get the joke. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I reached out to you because for a while now I've been following you, and it seems like everything that you comment on is something interesting, and I'm like, oh, I didn't think of it that way before. So I when it comes to content providing value to people, yours is free, and I've gotten a lot of value out of it. And so I thought, like, oh, let me get you on the podcast and talk some stuff out.
So thank you very much. I appreciate that. I try to be a worthwhile follower. I try to treat people's attention as kind of a chance or a gift they're giving me.
Yeah, right on. And it's so funny because when we were setting this up, you'd ask me like some, what sort of topics would what I'd like to cover, and I sent you some topics, and then of course I think, like you said, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of fun stuff for us to talk about day of, and one of the things that hit me right off the bat was one of your recent posts, I think as of today when we're recording, you talked about you have a history with psychedelics and ketamine in particular, and I was like, okay, this is where I got to start talking to you, because psychedelics is something that's so kind of beyond. Like I've never indulged in psychedelics unless you count. I remember having a very strong pot brownie some years back that I definitely hallucinated on, but I never knowingly I didn't knowingly go into it thinking I was going to trip my balls off. Can you talk about psychedelics and ketamine and wherever else you want to go with that?
Sure. Yeah. So I did a decent number of psychedelics in college, and honestly never really had that I guess profound or transformative of an experience with it. I don't think I've ever. This is something that is sort of hard to explain if you haven't done them, but I don't think I've ever hallucinated per se. I guess, as in like seen something that was just completely not there, right? Like in a sense, like if you imagine your field of view divided up into pixels, right? I don't think I've ever had an experience where I saw like a false pixel, right? What it is it changes the way that you sort of recognize patterns. So if you look at like a textured object, right? So like a field of grass or, like a sponge painted wall, that kind of thing, your mind will sort of configure it into shapes, right? Like, like seeing things in clouds, basically. That just gets cranked up to 11. And so you might see like faces or shapes or patterns or something like in these textured surfaces. But like if you went up and poked it, like each individual element that you can see would be there, right? So I've talked to people who say they have had like sort of, I guess you would say, like genuine hallucinations. Never happened to me. But my most interesting experiences with psychedelics, and by the way, I just want to preface all this by saying I don't unreservedly recommend them to people, right? I'm not an evangelist for psychedelics. I think they they have uses in certain circumstances, but they also carry genuine risks, and I think this is downplayed a lot. But on New Year's Eve 2022, I took a very strong dose of psilocybin mushrooms, and a lot of I had been a progressive for most of my life because I was just sort of the water I swam in. That was most of my social group and everything, and a lot of discomfort I'd had with a lot of progressive ideas sort of started to coalesce during that experience, right? So I just sat in a dark room and essentially typed a note into my phone for hours until like my arms were sore from holding up my phone. But just a lot of, sort of little niggling inconsistencies. In that state, I was finally able to sort of break through my hesitance to go against, my worldview and to go against sort of my tribe and put a lot of those things together. And so that was a big turning point for me. And then shortly after that, I uh, I had my experiences with medically supervised ketamine, basically, and that was to deal with uh, trauma responses due to something that happened to me when I was very young, and it was effective for that purpose, right? But between these two things, it really did help me break through various barriers, both ideological and personal, in a way that I don't know that I could have without them. But I also, it almost it felt like I sort of reset, right? It's like, okay, let's just train this neural net again. And in that process, for about a year after that, I would say I was pretty unstable. My moods would fluctuate wildly. I was like probably far too risk tolerant, right? I would just do crazy things without really worrying about the consequences. And eventually, I think I sort of gelled back into a stable configuration that's better than the one that I had before, definitely. But I'm kind of lucky that nothing terrible happened to me during that period of sort of reformation.
I love the idea of the shrooms having the effect of you kind of calling into question your progressive ideology, because so often drugs, especially psychedelics, are connected with like the hippie movement,
Mhm.
kind of the left. So for me, just as a comedian, just the idea of there being like MAGA shrooms or something like that out there, it sounds pretty incredible. And yeah, I do want. Yeah, I do wonder. The connection of sort of psychedelics, opening up like new pathways or ways of seeing the world. And it seems like you have people who have really strong like religious experiences that are almost
Mhm.
that are kind of on par with psychedelics, at least that I've read about, and that kind of takes them more towards I guess a religious or more conservative kind of way
Mhm.
of the world, and the idea that the possibility is there also like on like a political level is I think
Mhm.
really interesting. What do you think was like the biggest or like the uh, the hardest like kind of progressive idea that you had to like tackle? Like what was like the most like deep seated that you had to like you know uh, grapple with and get over? Yes.
Sure. So, I mean, one that was very personal for me at the time because I was living as trans when I had this experience was that my belief essentially in that whatever you want to call it, people quibble about the terms, but sort of gender ideology, the trans movement or whatever. My belief in sort of a lot of the core tenets of that movement just completely crumbled right during this experience. I was just like, I don't believe this stuff anymore. And it had a lot to do with the fact that like I was in Oklahoma City at the time, right? And like the LGBT community there is, as you might imagine, smaller than it is in, more
Right.
liberal places and therefore kind of tight knit. And so I'd been spending a lot of time with other trans people in particular. And just there were aspects of a lot of their behavior that bothered me in the context of this sort of belief system because I just noticed that like the natal males in almost every way except fashion behave just like natal males, right? And especially because of the early childhood experience I alluded to, the notion that I guess that like fear of men by women is legitimate is like very important to me, right? And so, if it were sort of, true in the sense that like these people were legitimately in some real psychological sense, behaviorally feminine, then that's sort of one thing. But that's really not what I observed, right? And that had made me deeply uncomfortable for obvious reasons, that like I had a lot of my own ego tied up in believing this. And during that experience, the way I sort of visualize psychedelics is like, if there's like a landscape of like hills and valleys of like possible configurations of your mind, and where you are currently is like a sort of noisy little marble rolling around in this landscape, right? It'll tend to get trapped in some local minimum. And psychedelics just increase the noise parameter, right? They make it easier to sort of leap out of the well that you're in and find your way into a different one, right? And that's not directional, right? It's not guaranteed to take you in any particular direction. You might end up in a worse valley than you started in, but it at least offers you the chance to sort of to leave sort of hard to escape configurations. And so, yeah, all of these things just sort of coalesced in this moment. And then, like, when I came down, I realized that, like, I, along with everyone else, had sort of joined the chorus of people condemning J.K. Rowling for her views, but I realized they'd never actually read her letter, because everyone just said,
Right.
"Oh, you don't need to bother. It's garbage. You don't need to read that," right? So I read it, and I realized I agreed with every single word of it. And from that moment, the dam kind of broke, right? I was already a heretic from my sort of progressive tribe, so the barrier to questioning everything else was lowered. And I guess I would say that, like, the foundational core, right? The sort of the factual issue that for me caused my same basic values, right? Which is a kind of loose consequentialism paired with a scientific approach to learning, right? To epistemology. Those values stayed constant, but a certain factual claim sort of inverting changed all the downstream political consequences of holding those values. And that was, why is the West wealthy, right? Is the West wealthy because of exploitation, right? And sort of like theft and brutality and underhanded trickery? Or are we wealthy because we produce wealth, and in particular because we produce knowledge, right? And if you just move that one piece, and you're someone who really cares about intellectual consistency, then almost everything else, kind of follows from that. So, those two pieces, right, sort of um, realize, finally kind of accepting that the representations, many of the claims and representations made by the trans movement are false. And obviously I didn't, somehow discover this on mushrooms. It was just that I was open to it now, and I did a lot of reading later. But coming to the conclusion that the West is primarily wealthy because we build things, right, not because we take things. Those two pieces, together were enough, if you sort of work out the logical consequences of them, to sort of invert my politics, essentially.
Yeah, and something that I remember seeing a little while back was an account called the Trans Maoist, which I thought was hilarious from just a historical perspective. And then you have like people who are Marxist Leninists, et cetera, who are also trans, and anyone who knows a little bit about the history of communism, when you have communist ideologues saying that like homosexuality is a bourgeoisie, capitalist, behavior, or I forget how they describe it.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that they would be open to, transgenderism just seems a little silly on its face, and especially Mao. I mean, who was all about getting rid of the four olds, and it's like, I don't know, him looking to get rid of the four olds. I don't know if he'd be into taking on this new thing, but the kind of like silliness there. So in your own, in your own life, when, like, how old were you when you were, living as trans, and how long did you, did you live that way?
So that would have been from about ages 26 to 30. I'm 31, almost 32 now. Yeah.
Okay. And with trans people, there's all different, I don't even know if you call it like stages, or like some people just kind of dress the part, other people take hormones, other people go and get surgery. Like, where, if you don't mind talking about, like,
Sure.
where were you on like that spectrum?
Yeah, so I took hormones, right? I was on the maximum dose of estrogen. And then I had surgery on my face, right, to like remove the brow ridge, right? That's a very distinctively like sexually dimorphic feature to reduce my jaw a little bit. And then I also had breast implants that I've since had removed.
Wow. What was that like? That going through that like body transformation? I mean, maybe we'd start with just estrogen right off the
Mhm.
bat, because when I just think of myself like I think of myself as a man. Now, when I think about like sort of my early days of like puberty and being in like middle school and just getting boners just by any female that passed by, is kind of it's kind of insane, the effect that
Mhm.
testosterone can have on someone, and then to go the other route of pumping like estrogen. I mean, what did you notice in your own, like, the changes in your body, your psychology?
hmm So as far as the psychological changes, I don't sort of trust my own like account of it that much
Mm,
because it's almost impossible to distinguish, excuse me, the chemical or neurological effects from just psychosomatic effects or expectation, right? Or the effects of living in this radically different way from how you've been living in the past. So people make all kinds of crazy claims about what estrogen does to them, and I'm not sure how many of those are correct, right? It does dampen the sex drive, right? Especially when paired with testosterone blockers, which you generally take with it. Um, as far as physical effects, right? So it softens your skin a little bit, right? You get sort of a subcutaneous sort of layer of fat under your skin that makes it softer. It reduces body hair growth. Unfortunately, it doesn't do that much for facial hair. You have to get that like
mm,
lasered off if you want that. Um, and then it affects fat distribution, right? And to really work that, so to speak, you pretty much have to cut down until you're incredibly thin, and then sort of gain weight back, because fat cells generally, like, except under unless you lose like a whole bunch of weight, you generally don't lose fat cells. They just sort of deflate, right? So if you gain weight back, it'll mostly stay in the same place unless you've lost enough to actually start, losing fat cells. Um, so yeah, I would say those were the primary physiological effects. It does reduce libido. For me, it didn't reduce it to zero, but it did cut it down substantially. And I do think it's a little bit um, psychologically destabilizing to run on sort of one hormonal regime for most of your life and then suddenly to switch to another one. So I think it I think it exacerbated my anxiety and neuroticism. I'm reasonably confident in that. Living that way itself will increase your neuroticism, right? Because like
mhm.
suddenly you constantly, in a way that I never did before, you're constantly thinking about how other people are perceiving you, right? Which is just a recipe. Like almost everybody who transitions has some sort of pre-existing mental health conditions, but this is really just a perfect way to exacerbate that and make it 10 times worse, because it's really uh kind of an accelerant for neuroticism. You're just constantly worried. It's like, did that person clock me? What are they thinking about me? Do they think I'm
Right.
weird? Are they uncomfortable? Right? Like, like, whereas like if in a sense I'm not like misrepresenting myself with my appearance, right? I'm portraying myself as me. You don't have to care, right? I don't have to care what anybody else perceives me as. But because the transness is inherently sort of about how people see you. You think about it all the time, right? So those would be the most notable physical and psychological effects, I think.
And when you got the implants, like,
Mhm.
how big did you go? Did you go like porn star? Like 1980s
Not
porn
not
star?
not absurd. I think I was
No.
between a C and a D cup.
I mean, that's a good
Yeah.
that's a fun night for sure. On the when it comes to women who transition to get like double mastectomies or top surgery, as the
Mhm.
euphemism is. Um, this is it might be just a thing with me, but I have like a very like like a physical revulsion to like scars, especially like really
Mm,
really ugly scars. So anytime that I see them, and obviously they're not doing it for me. I get that, but I
mhm,
automatically kind of cringe with pain, you know.
mm,
Um,
mhm.
and it's to a point. I said a while back, like, can't we just like normalize dudes with breasts? Like, can we just do that just so these young
Anything
women,
but this. Yeah.
yeah, it's just so these women just aren't, these females or whatever, just aren't, I don't know. It looks like they're hurting themselves, and I just don't.
Mhm.
And and yeah, and especially, I mean, then there's probably the straight guy, in me who's just like, oh man, we're getting rid of like really nice ones is such just a sin against God and nature. What was dating like, during that time? Were you dating men? Were you dating women, other trans folks, or?
My transition actually spans two different marriages of mine that have
Wow.
both ended. Yeah. And in the
You're
second
so you're
one,
so young. Like, man, like
I
like
know,
before your
it's
30s.
impressive, right?
Holy
I'm
shit.
really speed running this whole thing, but yeah, the second relationship was polyamorous, and yeah, I mean, I dated pretty extensively, right? So we might get into this, maybe now or later, but the 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 etiologies, right? The causes of transness in men uh, uh, do strange things, right? So I don't feel like I'm attracted to men at all, right? Like when I look at men, I look at the male body or whatever, it doesn't do anything for me. But I was attracted to the idea of myself taking on like a feminine role, right? Like that was sort of exciting to me. So I dated both men and women during this time period.
Is that
And
is
that
that
was a
like,
very strange experience. Yeah.
yeah, is that like the autogynephilia thing? Is that, how you
Yeah, yeah.
describe
So
that?
that's my etiology is I'm AGP. And yeah, it's a very strange thing, and it's confusing for people who are used to thinking about sexuality not in terms of like any kind of like latent psychological or neurological factor, but just in terms of behavior, right? Because AGPs are orientationally heterosexual, and what I mean by this is like, obviously these people's self-reports aren't reliable. They're just going to say whatever they think, sort of flatters their self-conception. But we can take them into the lab and use a technique called penile plethysmography, right? So the idea is it measures blood flow, right? So
Hmm.
we hook a measuring device up to people's genitals, and then we show them different stimuli, right? And then we can just measure the response, right? So we don't have to take their word for like what are you attracted to or who have you slept with in the past, right?
Right.
And when we do this, we find that that autogynephiles, right, who represent in the West at least something like 80% at least of male to female transitioners, do not respond to sexual stimulus of men, even if they self-report that they sleep with men, right? But they do respond to like cross-dressing narratives, basically, right? And sort of cross-gender narratives in general, and this is what drives a lot of the behavior.
Wow. And do you still have like those like strong like feelings, those impulses, or I don't know what the correct way to
Sure, sure.
ask.
Yeah, yeah. So, I still like it's still sort of a kink of mine, but like now that I sort of understand more what it is, right? I understand that it is a paraphilia and not an identity. It feels much less intense, right? It doesn't feel any more sort of totalizing or compelling than any other, kink somebody might have, right? Like somebody might be into BDSM, but they don't feel like, they'll die if they don't wear, leather outfits out into the world everywhere, right? It's not this like urgent, desperate thing anymore. And I really think that like the 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 paraphilia itself, right? There's decent reason to believe that autogynephilia is largely innate, but I think the way that people choose to respond to it and the intensity of like the pain it causes, right? Because the other side of autogynephilia, right, attraction to self as woman, is autoandrophobia, right, which is what's typically called gender dysphoria, right, which is that like you're kind of repulsed by being male, right, because your attraction circuitry is turned inward, and you're heterosexual, just sort of existing in a male body almost feels like being forced to be gay or something, right? Um, but yeah, so like, I still have that as a kink, but it doesn't, I don't really feel like I have dysphoria anymore, right? It doesn't bother me to exist as male because I'm processing it in a different way, right? I'm narrativizing it differently to myself.
And the your exes, your ex-wives, with it.
Yeah.
Um, uh, are you on good terms with them, or?
I haven't spoken to them in a while, but both the divorces were fairly amicable, I would say.
That's good. Yeah, because I'm thinking there was recently a uh, a person. I don't know if he was a politician. I think he was an economist, and he came out and basically said that he was transitioning, and um, a lot of people kind of came and sort of said rah rah, like they're a great economist and I support them, et cetera, et cetera. And all I could really think about was just how fucked up it is after the guy was married. I don't know, probably like 30 years to his wife to kind of do this.
Mhm.
And I think that that's something that I've seen like a lot of women talk about. They call them, I guess, like trans widows or something.
Yeah.
And no one really seems to give a shit about the women that are kind of left behind. Is I think it must be. I mean, it must be so painful to be living a life where you're not completely or you don't feel completely that you could be who you are. I think that that's terrible, but to kind of drag somebody along for decades and decades and have kids and stuff, and then one day say, okay, this is who I really am. I
Mhm.
don't know. It seems like you definitely didn't do that. Like you had your two relationships, but I don't know if you make anything of that, like what that says about
Uh,
somebody.
sure. Yeah. No. I mean, I'm probably less sympathetic than you because, like, I think one of the things that we have to do is to sort of dismantle the inaccurate framing that, the trans movement has put around a lot of these things is that I don't believe that like being trans should be considered an identity, but is rather an act, like transitioning is an action, right? Or a series of actions. But I don't think it's true that, this is like innately sort of who people are, except in the sense that like, the kink is probably innate, but responding to it in this particular way is not, it's not
Mm.
written into your genes, right? This didn't exist until, fairly recently in the, on historical timelines. So that's the first thing I would say is that like I don't buy the sort of sob, as someone who's gone through this, I don't buy the sort of sob story framing of like this is always who I was, and I just had to suppress it for all this time. I think rather it's the kind of thing that's largely modulated by your attention, right? Even if the proclivity for autogynephilia is we know it's at least partially heritable. There are sort of some brain structure differences between autogynephiles and non-autogynephilic males, right? But it's largely modulated by attention, right? If you pay a lot of attention to this, right, you spend all your time on trans forums, right? A lot of people, will report having done this, when they were closeted right before they came out, right? If you're constantly, sort of consuming this content, then it will increase the severity of it, right? So that's the first thing I would say is that like I don't think it should be framed as an identity. And then I would say that like yeah, I think it's deeply immoral. So, in my relationship, in my two marriages, right? In the first one, my wife was like non-binary identified, very encouraging, right? Almost sort of like suggested it, to me. Said that like, she'd always sort of thought that this was something going on with me. And then the second marriage started when I was already transitioned. So, I definitely don't feel like I
Oh yeah,
sort of rug pulled anybody
yeah.
in my relationships. But when people do that, I do think it's deeply immoral, right? Even more so if they have kids. But even if you don't, after 30 years of a relationship, I think it should essentially be considered, again, because of, sort of what autogynephilia is, I think it should be considered, morally equivalent to running off with the secretary. It's just that you're the secretary, right? Like you're sort of you're having an affair with yourself and you're letting that take precedence over your relationship with this person who's built a life with you. And I think that's deeply wrong.
Now I remember this is there was a thread that you had quote tweeted and commented on it, and that's and I got into it and said I actually think it's worse than running off with
Yeah.
the secretary. With with the the widows, as the trans widows, as they describe themselves. I've seen a number of women share kind of photos of them with their husbands before the husbands transitioned, and then pictures of the husband after the transition. And at least the ones that I've seen shared, it's like, oh my God, the husband's trying to look like the wife.
Yeah.
And it's really, it's something where I don't, I think there's probably there's probably a limit to allyship where it's kind of like, dude, can you not dye your hair the same color as your wife that you just left? Can you not get the same fucking bangs and shit and wear basically the same outfits? Like there's something really, there's something wrong there. That I think, that I think we should be able to say like, oh, that's a little odd.
Yeah, I mean, and when you understand that autogynephilia is the cause of almost all of these transitions, especially these like later life transitions of like not very, like obviously like heterosexual, like not very naturally feminine men, I guess you could say. They're essentially all autogynephiles, right? So the other type are like sort of they're pretty rare in the West, and they're extremely sort of prenatally under masculinized gay men, right? And you can really tell, once you understand these things and you've seen some examples, it's pretty easy to classify people, right, into which bucket they fall into. So like all of these trans widow stories basically involve autogynephiles, right? And then it makes sense that the people that they chose as partners, right, are people that they presumably find attractive, and that's also what they want to be, because their heterosexual attraction is, in their case, the origin of the desire to transition, right? It's just become sort of internalized. So in a sense, they're replacing their wives with themselves.
Wow. Shit. I'm working on a story. I don't know if I can, I'm a comedian and I write stories and scripts and stuff like that. And I'm trying to work on a story from an angle with a trans character. I'm not going to get, if I give away the the plot, then I just gave away the story. But all I want to say is like, I think human beings are incredibly fascinating, to say the least. Like this stuff has been, it's been wild. For when you're talking about, there was a book by the Dr. Bailey. I think it was The Man Who Would Be Queen. Is it?
Yeah. Michael Bailey. Love that guy.
Yeah, and that's where I first I first started hearing about this from my friend Deborah So, and then it was Deborah So, and maybe even before that, there's a woman, she wrote the book Galileo's Middle Finger. God, what the fuck's her name? I'm so sorry if I forgot your name, but she talks about the Bailey case in particular, how he had reported on basically autogynephilia, and he was immediately attacked just in every way possible. They basically tried to end his career. So that kind of put me down the rabbit hole. I didn't go too far down the rabbit hole. I didn't get any wigs or anything, but it is really really interesting. For sure.
Yeah, I think so too. No, I mean, like that's been one of the positive things to come out of all of this for me is I've developed a kind of a nerdy special interest in sexological research, right? Like what do we actually know? Not just about the causes of gender dysphoria, but also human sexuality in general. It's a really fascinating topic, and it's the kind of thing that the conclusions don't perfectly line up with what either side of the political aisle wants to believe, right? And so it's also a really great filter for people who are actually trying to seek the truth, right? Like if somebody really sort of does a deep dive into and understands the sexological literature, especially on these sort of charged topics. That's a great signal that that person is actually trying to understand the world rather than just being sort of a partisan cheerleader. So yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic.
Yeah. Um, uh, so one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was this idea that, can arguments really change people's views? And I think you came out on X, and you were very much a yes on that.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I kind of go back and forth because I try to think like, do I have any like firsthand experience with like there's something I used to believe and then I changed my mind on it. Um, and I'm sure if I took the time, I could list a lot of stuff. But off the top of my head, I feel like I'm like, oh man, I'm a stubborn asshole. And I don't know. I'm like, I don't know if I've ever changed my mind. But actually, recently, I did change my mind, and it's in regards to health and cholesterol. I have high cholesterol that I'm in need of taking care of. And I was, kind of the mind like, oh, it doesn't matter, cholesterol. What matters is what's the ratio or something like that. And then I ended up, finding out like, oh, well, there's this thing. It's like the little a lipo something, and it's something that's genetic. You really can't do anything about it. You got it. If you have it, you're kind of fucked. So you got to change your lifestyle. So I guess that was something where it's like, okay, well, I definitely changed my mind about that, and perhaps I changed my mind about that because it's just the reality of I have a body and I'm mortal and I want to live a long time, and just tell me what I need to not eat anymore, and I will not eat that anymore, and I'll get on the bike. That if for those of you who are just listening, there's a stationary bike behind me. Let me get on there and get my heart rate up and all that. But so yeah, but in general, do have you changed minds, or you're hopeful?
Yeah, so I've had the experience of changing a decent number of people's minds personally, right? In various contexts, right? People in my life, right? Family, friends, that kind of thing. I've changed views. I've changed people's views pretty significantly. Also, sort of online, right? People told me that, I've convinced them of, various claims or whatever that were very hard for them to accept. Even, some pretty dramatic reversals, right? There's somebody I know who I didn't even see the first direct message he sent me before he sent the follow-up. But the first message he sent me was essentially, just like fuck you. And then like he sent me this really long follow-up message that was like, hey, I've been going through your posts for like the last 3 hours, and I think you're right about everything, right? And it was really interesting. And like that guy actually went on to host some debates that I took part in, and I could definitely feel people moving in that context also. So yeah, I mean, I think that as a rule, I agree that like the average person's view on anything that's at all emotionally important to them is generally not responsive to argumentation, right? But I do think, so I would say that like persuasion by argument is the exception, but not the rule, but the exceptions matter a lot, right? So I think it depends on the persuader, right? I think it depends on the persuadee, right? They have to at least be in principle open to the idea that they could change their view, right? They have to care about believing true things, right? Otherwise, why would you if all you care about is believing things that are socially convenient, why would arguments matter to you at all, right? All you have to do is sort of take the temperature of your social circle. And I do think that's how most people think about most things. But I do, have a sort of optimistic belief that people's ability to attain power positively correlates with openness to argumentation, right? So even though people who are persuadable by argument and evidence are definitely a minority of the population for most issues, not for things that they don't really care about at all, right? You can push people around on things that are just dry factual issues to them. I'm talking about, sort of politically and emotionally charged issues. But I do think that the people who can be persuaded are at least somewhat, statistically more likely to be in positions of power and influence, especially in the private sector, right? This is maybe less true of politicians who essentially exist to be like these tribalist cheerleaders, right?
Hmm.
But in the private sector, I do think that success correlates with willingness to be proven wrong for the obvious reason that like if you stick to a losing idea, despite all the evidence, that's a great way to bankrupt yourself and your company, So the reason why I have hope for persuasion is because not because I think we can persuade the majority of people directly by argumentation, but I think we can persuade enough influential people that they will sort of change both they'll make decisions based on their new beliefs, which is good if you think those beliefs are more accurate, but also that they will sort of change the social calculus for the people that make up their minds that way. Basically, they'll be like, oh, this important person thinks this, maybe I can actually consider it now. It's no longer like totally verboten.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm a few weeks back, I went to a friend's birthday party, and we've known each other since college. We started doing comedy together. At least I started. He was doing it like a little bit before me, um, and it was sort of like a 20+ year reunion with friends that I'd gone to college with, um, and I think when I was in college, I was definitely more on the more of a liberal side, but I guess maybe even in some ways going towards more the leftist. And after 20 years, I've changed my views on quite a bit of stuff, and there were quite a few of us that I think we definitely disagree on a number of things, but at the very least there are maybe like some important subjects that we do agree on and that we know we could talk about. And it's sort of like I think that's really important too, to at least if you're going to have a conversation with somebody, especially if you want it to be, it's good to have respect for the person that you're talking to. And I think if there is like a topic where well, I agree with Hunter on this topic, so there's a chance that even though I might disagree with him on this, he could be right, I could be wrong, but also I know he's not a bad person, and it's a lot easier to come into an argument, into a discussion with in good faith. And I have a number of friends there were kind of like taking me to the side and wanting to know like, hey, what do you think about this and that, because I'm kind of the libertarian, I don't know, sometimes right wing guy. And I have like one guy I was talking to he was a doctor, and he was practicing during COVID, the height of COVID, and the whole way that was handled really red pilled him. And he's like, dude, I'm fucking red pilled. He's like, I turn around and I'm like, I was here going through this shit and hearing what I was being told and seeing what these mandates were and all that, and saying that's bullshit. How are we doing this? And it's sort of like, all you need is that one red pill on this one subject, and now you're more open to talk with people who you might not otherwise have conversations with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the weaknesses, luckily, in the sort of, I guess you could say, like the consensus narrative on the more on the liberal or left side, is that because it's all sort of enforced as a package, right? You're not supposed to pick and choose. It's just like totally surrender your sort of your rights to form your own worldview to this class of experts and pundits and stuff, right? It's like like do your own research is like a negative meme in that circle. Right? I remember using it that way myself, right? It's like you think you know better than that, but like if that's how your worldview is sort of enforced, then all it takes is one chink, right? As soon as this is why I think so many people first break on the trans issue, and then sort of domino into just being like right wing on a lot of other issues, is because as soon as that the experts, right, capital E, will lie to you on one issue, you can no longer blindly trust them, right? You're no longer comfortable outsourcing your thinking to them. And so as soon as you get one chink, just like for your friend, it was the COVID response. right? Suddenly you're no longer so sure about all the other things that you thought were, the well-established consensus.
Yeah, yeah, and with and I think on the trans issue, I think years back, I would probably call myself like a strong ally. I remember with all the
Mm,
bath when all like the bathroom stuff was happening, like kind of I
mm,
forget it was like the Carolinas or um, and I was doing a podcast with a trans comedian and saying like, it's just looking at it from like a practical standpoint, like I care about you and I worry about your safety. This is a person who had been like attacked on the street in Los Angeles, and I was really upset about hearing that they
mm,
went through that. But I was trying to like have a practical conversation of like how do you codify this into law, because then you have to define, well, what is a woman, or what constitutes a woman
mm,
legally, to be able to use this bathroom, and then dealing with the fact where you're going to have guys who are going to use this as a loophole to be
mm,
complete perverts. And it's like, I know you're not that person, but
mm,
you have to be willing to admit there are people who are going to I'm going to try to use whatever loophole they can to to get ahead, or to use this to their own perversions. And that was a while back. And over the years, I think what really kind of made me less of an ally, and sometimes an outright bore on this subject, is when kids were getting involved, like transitioning children and all that. And look, I'm wearing my XXXY athletics hat. I'm an affiliate to protect women's sports, and it's
mm,
sort of, it just got to a point where it's like, man, I can't, if the most vocal people in your movement are talking about transing kids and then allowing males to play in women's sports, we can't, I'm sorry, I
mm.
can't go that way anymore. Now I'm just going to be louder and maybe an asshole about it. So,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, and I think that your views are in line with, the vast majority of the country, right? And I actually think the polls understate it. And I think this because of other polls, right? So currently, allowing natal males to males, right? It's not like you
right.
can actually change, to play in women's sports, it's like a 20 to 80 issue right now. And I actually think that underestimates the severity of the opposition, because when we do surveys of like what people think these various terms mean, right? A lot of people don't know what they mean, because like
Yeah.
they're not heavily invested in this. It's not part of their life. It doesn't matter to them, right? So like a decent number of people, when they read a poll question that says like, should trans women be allowed to play in women's sports, they think this means women who identify as men, not men who identify as women,
Right.
right? Like they're not immersed in this. And like a lot of the people on both sides of the issue spend a lot of their time thinking and talking about this, can easily forget that to a lot of people, this is not very salient, right? And so, every time I see a poll result, I always just think like, it's probably even worse, right? And to me, the problem was with the movement is just the utter refusal to even entertain the idea of compromising, or to entertain the idea that any of their opponents' objections have any kind of merit at all, right? It's this really, again, I think this is largely driven by the fact that, you know, uh, trans identity is extremely highly correlated with general mental illness, right? Um, it makes it more likely that you have like pretty much any mental illness that you can name, I think. And so you have this population of people who are not super emotionally stable, and have really sort of bet their egos and their identities on this idea that they really, really, truly are women, are men in the opposite case, right? And they've probably lost friends and family over this, right? They've angrily corrected people when they were misgendered or something, right? They've really sort of walked far out along this branch, right? And so it's not that most of them want to play sports, right? Like
Mhm.
most like male to females are nerds, right? Like it's associated, like autogynephilia is associated with like high IQ and autism, right? These people are
Right.
mostly nerds. It's not like most of them even want to play sports. The reason why they're so stuck on this issue, even when it's costing them, they're just bleeding support over it, is because if any distinction is made between MTFs and women, right, then that punctures the whole self image, right? That would mean that we all still know you're male, and like we're just sort of playing along to be kind or whatever, right? And that's not acceptable. They were promised that they can really, truly, in some sense, get to be women, and any deviation from that is totally unacceptable. You know, if the movement had gone in like sort of a more, I guess, like clinical and sort of libertarian direction, right? Where they just said, like, yes, we're people who have a strange psychological disorder that causes us to really want to do this thing. If you like us, it's polite, you know, to use the pronouns or whatever, but like, we're not going to try to like get you fired or force you to do it if you don't want, if you're not comfortable with that, right? If they had just essentially said, like, we ask nothing but to be left alone to do our thing, and if you care, here's, you know, some etiquette or something that we would like, but it's not a demand, right? If that was the direction it would go, you know, it had gone, I don't think anybody would care, right? I don't think this would even be a major political issue. And I think that because that's essentially how things were, you know, from the 60s until the, you know, sort of the 2010s, really, right? And nobody really cared about it, right? Occasionally it would be, you know, sort of they'd have them on, you know, Jerry Springer or something. It's like a shock
Right.
value thing. But beyond that, nobody thought about this, right? It wasn't part of anyone's consciousness. It wasn't part of the platforms of either major political party, right? The issue were the entire issue has been the increasingly extreme, belligerent, and totally inflexible demands for, you know, more and more and more and more. And it's almost as if they have a drive to destroy their own movement, right? As soon as they, you know, attain one level of recognition, they immediately have to go on to demand something further. It's almost like they were always going to keep pushing until they reached, you know, sort of people's breaking point, and they're well over that now at this point. You know, nobody wants the medic, you know, nobody except the most extreme ideologues, you know, wants the medicalization of children. You know, nobody but the most extreme ideologues thinks it's reasonable for them to play in women's sports, right? And you know, the thing that's been really shocking for me to see is the total inability of the Democratic Party to pivot on this issue, right? To just
Hmm.
say,
Yeah.
like, okay, we were wrong, right? A supermajority of Democrats, right? Not the general population, the supermajority, like 67% of Democrats are against, you know, males playing in women's sports. And yet, you know, when the bill came up for a vote to you know, that would address this issue, right? It's the closest thing we're ever going to get to, like, you know, a just huge overwhelming societal consensus, right? There's enough public support for this to pass it as a constitutional amendment, right? It's a really high bar. Not a single Democratic representative voted for the bill, right? And that's, it's just amazing to me. It's amazing how somehow, even though they've completely lost the public, right, this ideology still has hold over so many of our institutions. And you know, it's not going to be pleasant for them as everything sort of crumbles around them, you know. And you know, I think they're going to wish they'd taken the route that I outlined.
Yeah. I mean, Elizabeth Warren, you know, gave you know, her Republican, you know, critics a huge weapon, because not only did she vote no on it, but she did a visual thumbs down, that,
Yeah,
you know, people can just clip um, and use that.
caption. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
With and with the sports thing, I mean, there was a recent one, a track, you know, track and field, high school. This kid did the long jump and came in first place, and I think the second place girl lost by 8 feet. So
yeah,
this kid jumped 8 feet farther than the girl, and
yeah.
it's like, you know, could you have done it? Could you just maybe jump 3 feet more? Maybe just 1 foot? Like, I
Trim it
know,
down a bit.
yeah, I know that goes, you know, against the idea of competition, you know, holding back, but fuck, man, you're not helping your cause when people are going to be like, the kid jumped fucking 8 feet, you know, farther than my
Yeah,
daughter, you know. Um,
yeah. No, there's this similar thing. Like, there's this famous picture of Lia Thomas and a
yeah,
bunch of women, you know, for some swim competition, and they're all diving off the platforms, and like Leah's, you know, trajectory is like just very noticeable. They're all, they can all get about the same amount of distance, and then Lia is just like shooting way ahead, just in the initial jump, right? And
Yeah.
it's like you can't, and frankly, I'm glad to find out that the sort of information control regime was not strong enough to get people to accept that, right? When you shove
Yeah.
something just that blatantly absurd in people's faces, they were still like, okay, no, I don't care what all the experts say or whatever. Like, this is like, I can see with my eyeballs that this is absurd, right?
Yeah. And I've been seeing too, like another argument that's just not helping that side. Basically, kind of doing a comparison between, Nancy Mace, and Nancy Mace is definitely, I think she's going to the well a little too much on the bathroom issue. It's like, I feel like this woman needs to get like, her bowels checked, because it seems like she's going to the bathroom way too much during the day. But she's made this idea like women's restrooms for women only, and then critics are saying, oh, this is just like segregation, and like the civil rights movement of the 60s. And something that I've had a fun time just reminding people is, if you go back to the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr., Lyndon Johnson, Malcolm X, and even the Ku Klux Klan would be against men using women's bathrooms.
Everybody would have.
It would be a uniting force between the most fucking disgusting segregationists and civil rights activists. Yeah. Well, it's just like, not everything that's happening today has a mirror a mirror image of history. It's like there's a point when the analogies doesn't work. Like, just stop doing the analogies and start dealing with the situation as it is, in the here and now.
Yeah. I think that there are a lot of people who are essentially, I'm not saying this is their conscious motivation, but they're kind of upset that they missed out on the civil rights movement, right? And they really want a chance to be like righteous warriors for justice. But the fact is that like there really is not a lot of consequential, invidious discrimination against any of these minorities today, right? And I think that like in general, also the idea that discrimination, right, taking that word literally, is always bad, right? Is a mistake, right? Because discrimination really just means differentiating between classes of people, right? And that's appropriate to do when classes of people really are different in some way that's relevant to whatever you're doing, right? Men and women are different, right? The average man poses, statistically much, much more of a risk to women than the average woman does, right? That is a fact. So in situations where that's relevant, right? Private spaces, domestic violence shelters, these very sensitive situations where that concern is relevant, it is appropriate to discriminate between like males and females, right? And the idea that we can never notice any differences between people in any way is like an absurd like reductio ad absurdum of like the sort of basic premises of the civil rights movement, right? Which to the steelman of the civil rights movement, at least, is that like they were saying that like we shouldn't discriminate in situations where it's not relevant, right? When in situations where there is no sort of rational basis for having these preferences, right? That we shouldn't disadvantage classes of people in those situations. That does not imply that there is never a situation in which it's appropriate to differentiate between people, right? So like for an obvious example that only the craziest people are really opposed to, we discriminate between like felons and non-felons in the sense that like felons don't get rights. You know what I mean? They have to live in prison, right? They have to live in a box. So like obviously we sometimes have to distinguish between classes of people, right? And like that seems reasonable to me. And we even do it, based on things that people don't choose, right? Based on inborn characteristics. If someone is severely schizophrenic, right, a family member might be given power of attorney over them, right? Because they can't be trusted to make their own decisions, right? That is discriminating, against somebody on the basis of an innate characteristic that they didn't choose. And it's also obviously, it's common sense and obviously, better than letting them just sort of ruin their own lives, right? So in general, I really think people have universalized this principle in a way that doesn't actually make any sense if you just sit and think about it for a second. So like, yeah, in a sense, having sex segregated spaces is by definition a form of discrimination, and it's a reasonable form of discrimination, right? And that we're differentiating classes of people that are in fact different.
Mm-hmm. And how does it? I would imagine, being someone who teaches stats, statistics are just a huge weapon to wield, and it's something where I think I could probably count myself, and I think most people don't know how to read statistics or understand how they come at how one comes to them. So and as a teacher, like what are some of the lessons that you're giving your students? Like what is it that what don't you know before taking a stats class that by the end of the stats class you will know or need to know?
Sure. So most of my teaching is technical, right, and theoretical, right. I'm basically just teaching the machinery of statistics. But it's good to just understand the concept of a probability distribution, right? The concept of different kinds of averages, right? Mean, median, mode. And it's useful to have some hands-on experience working with these things so that you can immediately visualize what you're talking about, right? So if you think about, there's this meme, right? That's just basically about people who it's not just that they don't understand statistics, they don't understand like the concept of statistics, right?
Is this the airplane?
High level. Oh no, I was gonna say the meme goes like, okay, the median woman is 5'4", but I'm 5'8", right?
Right.
It's like that's not a refutation of anything I said, right? And there's this you see this generally in a lot of leftist arguments, even from people who probably should know better, right? Where they can't understand, like for them, the only two possibilities are that two categories are completely and absolutely categorically distinct and there's no overlap whatsoever, or they're the same, right? And those are the only two things they can understand, right? So like if you say something like men are taller than women, right? They'll come back with like, well, I know some woman who's 6'3" and a guy who's 5'1". It's like, that's great, that's good for you, right? And you see the same thing with them trying to like sort of ship of Theseus away the notion of like binary sex with edge cases, right? You know what I mean? Right. So they'll say, oh, okay, but what about like people with congenital androgen insensitivity syndrome? They have XY chromosomes and internal, testes rather than ovaries, but they appear totally phenotypically female and usually don't even know they have this condition until puberty. They just think they're women. They all sort of live their lives. It's like, okay, that's fine. But like that doesn't matter if we're talking about a bunch of people who don't have that condition, right? Like,
exactly, which are the vast amount of people, who we're talking about.
Right, and this would destroy any sort of natural language category, right? Anything above the level of fundamental particles could be destroyed by this kind of argumentation, right? So like, where does like chair end and bench begin, right? You're not going to find an exact like clean cut, right? Where like, the slightest perturbation would move it back and forth between chair and bench in a way that everybody would agree on unambiguously. No, like categories in, at the macroscopic level are not perfectly defined like cubes that are totally, separate from each other. They're clusters, right? Like there are a lot of things that are sort of close to this kind of idea. And there are a lot of things that are sort of close to this idea. And then there might be like a few things that are sort of ambiguously between them, such that they can't be cleanly categorized. That doesn't mean that these categories aren't useful, right? That doesn't mean, in fact, that they're not the best categories, right? That they're the best way that, that we can understand the world. And like, so that would be something that I think, I would hope at least, statistical literacy would make clear to people, is just that, and, also frankly, physical literacy, studying physics also is good for understanding that, nothing in physical reality is ever exact, right? And so if your standard is like, it debunks something if that thing is not like literally mathematically exact, well, you've debunked everything. You've debunked every conceivable thing, right? So great work,
Yeah, like me with my cholesterol. Like, well, my cholesterol isn't 300, so how can it be high?
Right,
it's like, well, it's fucking high, dude. So
right, no, it's only 299. There's this sharp edge. No, nothing is sharp edge, right? Yeah. Everything is a little bit fuzzy in nature,
Exactly. Well, Hunter, man, thank you so much for taking the time. I really enjoyed this episode, our conversation, and I want all you guys, if you follow me, you got to follow Hunter. You're really going to enjoy his stuff. You can follow him at Artemis Consort on X. All right. Thanks, dude.
Thanks so much, Lou. I had a great time.